Thanks a lot for that introduction. I really love that you guys just heard from this guy about like how to create an oh shit moment. So I'm hopefully going to flip the perspective around a little bit. Before we get started, just a little bit about myself. I'm based out of DC. I work for a cool company called Expel. We do a lot of awesome stuff. One of the things I've been working on recently is like helping organizations defend against attacks in their cloud infrastructure and against their cloud applications. Huge fan of BSides, BSides DC goer. First time here at BSides Portland. It's been awesome so far. I think you guys are doing a really great thing with this event. And let's dive into it. So this is what you guys are in for today. We're just going to talk a little bit about the problem space. I probably don't have to explain it to most of you, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time there. We'll talk about how you can set yourself up for success when we think about protecting yourself, defending against attacks in Office 365. We'll talk about how you can consume data and identify unusual things, evil in Office 365. We'll talk about how you take an alert, something that might be suspicious, and actually run that down and determine what the heck it is, if it's good or if it's bad. And then we'll kind of round things out with some trends that we're seeing in terms of what you can do to actually get better and prevent these types of attacks. So it should be no surprise to you guys that like cloud is a thing. So quick show of hands, like who uses Office 365 right now? Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. Everybody, right? These days you're either cloud-born or you're rapidly moving there. A lot of great reasons for this. It's a great service, convenience, liability, generally better user experience. As we know in the security community, however, generally when we move on to or adopt something new, security is often like an afterthought, right? So when we start to leverage these cloud applications, software as a service like Office 365, we have to kind of wrap our heads around this idea of security as a shared responsibility. So Microsoft is actually a big proponent of this themselves. If you think about it, as you offload more functions to your SaaS provider like Microsoft, you don't have to worry about certain aspects of like security. For example, you don't have to think about worrying about physical security for the Microsoft data center, right? That's their problem. You don't have to worry about processes running on Exchange boxes, like that's Microsoft's problem. And even if you wanted to, like Microsoft doesn't give you that control or visibility, right? And in some cases, it seems like it's tempting for us to overestimate the responsibilities of that cloud provider, right? They're doing all this stuff. Do we really have to worry about anything at all? But when reality strikes, when we actually move here, often we kind of left like feeling like this guy on the right, where all of a sudden we realize, wait, actually we still do have some responsibilities. We're not super clear on what they are. We don't really understand them. And also we have to deal with all kinds of new threats, new security controls, and that kind of creates some uncertainty and a little bit of, it makes it difficult for security teams to understand what they actually need to do, what they actually need to worry about with Office 365. And that kind of leads us to the motivation for this talk. So we've been on this journey to Expel. I've been on it as well, trying to figure out how we can help organizations detect and respond to attacks in Office 365. And I think we've learned some insights along the way that I can share with you all, hopefully some tidbits and tips and tricks that you can take back, think about, maybe implement in your own environment. Hopefully avoid that oh shit moment. So right off the bat, like what do you need to do to set yourself up for success? I'm sure many of you are familiar with Office 365 Audit Log. It's basically this magic button that you need to press right off the bat. And that'll start to record everything that happens in Office 365. Why it's not on by default, I don't know. But super important that you need to enable this, right? Like the last thing you want to worry about like is somebody's owned and all of a sudden you realize you don't have the evidence to go back and figure out like what's going on. So definitely recommend you do this right off the bat. It's a simple button press, or you can do some PowerShell magic to make it happen. So it doesn't really end there. As luck would have it, there are some more configuration things you probably want to think about. Although the audit log does record most of the things that go on in Office 365 that you care about, it doesn't include like all sorts of specific operations that occur when users interact with their mailbox. So every time they log into their mailbox, when they create objects, delete objects, move things around, create inbox rules, things like that. And we'll talk in a few slides like why those events are important. But just another thing you need to be aware of, it's kind of a hidden thing that's not enabled by default, and you definitely want to check it out and run some PowerShell to make it happen. Some weird stuff to note, like that was confusing to me when I first looked at this. Some things that are maybe not intuitive, like how long those audit logs live actually depends on like how much you pay Microsoft. So if you're using the very popular E3 subscription, you get it for 90 days. If you pay a whole bucket load of money for E5, which not many people do, you get a year, just something to be aware of. Also, not intuitive at all, but like not all events actually show up in the audit log in real time. So if you're trying to run something down that's actually happening right now, keep in mind that you may have to wait like up to 30 minutes for some types of events to show up. And in some cases, like for like Azure Active Directory, it's literally 24 hours that you have to sit there and wait. So kind of confusing, but something to be aware of. So let's say you do check all these magic boxes, you've turned it all on. How do you actually access that data, right? A couple options. You can use the user interface, the awesome Microsoft user interface everybody loves. You can run a search that way in the Security Compliance Center. There's a PowerShell commandlet that makes it easy as well. If you're actually developing a product and you want to consume this data like continuously, Microsoft recommends that you use their management API for that. So once you've got all those buttons pressed and enabled, and you've waited like a painful 24 hours for the data to actually start flowing, you'll be able to query events. But that's really no good use to you if you don't know how to understand and interpret those events, right? Like how do you actually interpret the data that this thing records? Luckily for us, Microsoft actually has put together a really good knowledge base article on this. Just bookmark it. It's invaluable. It pretty much describes every single field that exists in the audit log and has a pretty good description of what that field means. There's some high value fields here that you're very frequently going to be using, things like the user ID, which is the user that did the thing. There's a client info string, which is the user agent, so what application generated this request. IP address, obviously where the request came from, and operation, which is the thing that the user did, right? Cool. So we have auditing enabled. We have a basic understanding of what those audit events look like. So how do you start to leverage that for detection and response? We talked about a few ways you can query things ad hoc and look for stuff during the course of investigation. That's fine and dandy, but that doesn't make continuous monitoring, right? So how do you actually monitor this stuff in real time? The easiest path forward there is to hook the data up to your SIEM of choice. It doesn't have to be any of these logos, but I've had good luck with them. A lot of these vendors, it's just a couple button presses and you'll be good to go. One thing I'll call out, if you're not familiar with Azure Log Analytics, you don't have a SIEM, and you're going to Azure already, you definitely want to check it out. It's literally a few clicks, and a lot of this data just shows up automatically, which is pretty nifty. And they're rapidly developing into, so they got a pretty awesome query language. All right, cool. So we've got data flowing. Now the challenge becomes how do you transform those hundreds of thousands of events that you're consuming on a daily basis into things that are actually actionable, that are interesting to you. So let's say we're interested in, for example, attacker activity, users doing things that they shouldn't. There's a lot of ways to slice and dice this data. There's a whole bunch of different types of events in the audit logs, but we're going to talk about three kind of high-level categories today. One being authentication, two being post-authentication, so they've logged in, what kind of activities are they doing afterwards, and then we'll round out with some examples of say they pop an administrative user, what kind of doors does that unlock for them? So starting with authentication, right off the bat, one really easy thing you can do is just look at the source of where people are logging in from, right? This is not exactly a novel technique. We've been doing this for a while with other sources of data. And it definitely gets flack for being oversimplistic, filtering based on country. It's easy to get around it, right? But at the end of the day, this is a very low-hanging fruit, and you'll be surprised sometimes what falls out of this. So if you look at where you're doing business as an organization, the hotspots become very apparent, the big red dots. The stuff that sticks out that's really weird is instances where only one user has ever logged in from that location, and it's not a common travel destination, right? Who vacations off the coast of Nigeria? Joking aside, somebody did do that once. That was weird. Cool. So you might be wondering this. Okay, this is cool. It's a good start. Not exactly novel. Can we take this up a level? What else could we do with authentication logs? One of the things that's pretty cool about authentication in Office 365 is just like the sheer volume of data that you get, especially when you like enable mailbox auditing. You actually get pretty granular information like where your users are on a pretty like a daily, on an hourly basis. So we can use that to our advantage to kind of track the physical location of our users and try to identify maybe a compromised account, right? The general idea here is like you should only be able to travel so fast between physical locations. Unless you're strapping yourself like to a rocket like this guy, you're not going to travel faster than 650 miles an hour. So when you look at user authentications, you can identify things like this user normally like just logged in from their New York office and then an hour later logged in from Nigeria. Like they would have had to travel 4,000 miles an hour to get there. So some common false positives I'll call out here that you'll run into if you try to do this. VPN proxy services, that's going to throw you off. If somebody hops on their VPN, it's going to look like they traveled all the way around the world in a few seconds, and obviously they didn't. And mobile networks can be kind of a pain as well. So if you're connected to your corporate Wi-Fi on your phone and you walk across the street to get Starbucks, you're going to bounce around between Verizon, your Wi-Fi, Starbucks Wi-Fi. It's going to look like you're traveling like all sorts of different directions pretty quick. There's a couple ways you can pretty easily filter that stuff out. You can identify VPN providers and like proxies. There's services out there like IP Hub that make this easy. You can filter out the mobile traffic based on the ISP. That makes it pretty obvious. And just user agents as well, right?
How about multiple devices? If somebody leaves their laptop in New York and travels, okay.
I love the segue. So speaking of user agents, I didn't pay you, by the way. Yeah, speaking of user agents, that's another really interesting property about authentication, right? Like, is you can get a sense for what client application initiated the request. Now we all know like you can't necessarily trust the user agent. People can forge it, blah blah blah. Yeah, right. But all that aside, there's some pretty interesting stuff you can look for, right? One, you can just try to profile the number of devices that a user has, right? You think about the average user, you're going to have like your phone, your laptop. That's pretty much it. Once you start to see like 3, 4 devices, that gets a bit unusual, especially when you start to see like flip-flopping between different operating systems. Like if somebody normally connects from their iPhone and then all of a sudden we see Android and iPhone back and forth, like that's pretty weird. Obviously, like very minor changes like version numbers, changes in the browser that they're using, that's less suspicious. That's no big deal. And the other thing you can look for with user agents, specifically with Office 365, is like you can see if they connected to through OWA or through like an application installed on their device. So like to talk through the table on the right, this is an example of like a distribution of a compromised user account's user agent strings. And we're just stacking based on the frequency of the user agent string, and we've normalized out the version numbers, so that's just replaced with an uppercase D. And there's a couple of things that stood out about this case. We can see already like the colored dots correspond with the operating system that's associated with that user agent string. So already this guy has like a Windows laptop, he's got an iPhone, and then he's also connecting via OSX. So 3 devices, like not unheard of, but it's kind of unusual. And then we also see like he connected via OWA, which is pretty weird because we can tell from the user agent strings that he's got Outlook installed on his Windows laptop. He's using a mail app on his iPhone, so like, what purpose would this guy have of like logging in through OWA?
Have you ever tried to search in Outlook? Sometimes you have to use Outlook.
There are exceptions to these rules, yes. Some things that can help with this, there's actually some pretty good user agent databases out there. You can bounce user agent strings off and you'll get like, hey, here's the vendor, here's the browser it's associated with, which definitely helps with enriching this data. One other property that's pretty interesting for authentication is just looking for like the use of anonymizer services in general. There are legitimate use cases for anonymizer service. We love VPN services in the security community, obviously. If you, for example, have an authorized VPN service that you install on like all of your laptops, you could look for anything falling outside of that, people using other services. One interesting thing we came across here, I'll mention like, is like kind of evolving TTPs. So like we've had a couple clients where we continuously kick these people out of compromised accounts. And when they come back, they always do something a little bit different, right? This client in particular had decided like, hey, we're going to use conditional access policies and we're going to block everything outside of the US. Great. So we would start to see these messages come across like attempted authentications and they'd be blocked due to that conditional access policy. What's kind of interesting about that is if you actually read the nuances of Microsoft's documentation on conditional access policies, that's evaluated after a successful authentication. So when you see this message show up, it means somebody is where they shouldn't be and had the right password. So that's kind of interesting to look for by itself. Even more interesting is when you correlate that with like a success from a proxy or VPN service. What we were seeing was they would attempt to authenticate from a blacklisted country, and then when it didn't work, they'd hop on a VPN, pop up in the US, and success from there. So correlating those two things together is pretty interesting. All right, so we talked a little bit about what you can do with authentication events. Let's talk a little bit about like, okay, they've got compromised credentials, they logged in, they're going to do a series of activities after that, and what can we look for that might flag us that something suspicious is going on. We know attackers generally want to persist in an environment once they have compromised credentials, they want to fly under the radar, and they have some sort of goal in mind. So we can take that and kind of our know-how about like how Office 365 works to identify some behaviors that they may attempt to do. One thing that we see all the time is this idea of evil inbox rules. So I'm sure we're all familiar with like the concept of an inbox rule. We use it to keep our inboxes clean. We will send all that spam to the trash. We'll send those reports to reports folder. Very useful. It turns out attackers use this all the time as well to send stuff they don't want you to see to a place where you can't see it. So if legitimate users use inbox rules and bad guys use inbox rules, like what's the difference? How can you tell, right? A couple of things you can look for. Look at the action. So users typically don't create inbox rules that delete messages. Like we like to keep our data somewhere just in case we made a mistake, right? That's unusual. You can look for actions where they're moving stuff to an unusual place. We'll get into an example in a second. And you can look for unusual keywords. Things like infected malware virus. Now, I know what you guys are thinking, right? Like, you're telling me this guy has compromised credentials and he created an inbox rule with the word malware in it. Why would he do that? So let's talk about it. So we've got 3 examples here. We'll go left to right. And these are all real examples that I sanitized from recent incidents. So the first one on the left, somebody created an inbox rule with the name 1. And it's deleting all messages that have any of these keywords. So things like delivery failure, document, email, spam, virus, hack. And what's kind of cool when you look at and you analyze these inbox rules is you can sort of understand what the attacker was trying to do. You can get at their intent by looking at what these inbox rules do. In this case, this guy was trying to mask the fact that he had compromised an email account and was like spamming out email to 1,000 other places. And he's trying to essentially send all the bounce backs like to the void. So the compromised user doesn't realize that they've been popped, right? Now, obviously that's not pretty subtle. One glance at that rule and you can tell it's pretty unusual. But as I mentioned, like as you start to kick these people out of your networks, they'll come back and they'll evolve their techniques to try to bypass any detections that you put in place. So the second rule in the middle, there is an example of that. Same customer. They created a rule with the name period. Great. But interesting, instead of using subject keywords, now they're looking at the from address. So if you'd created some sort of detection rule that looked for keywords in the subject, this would evade your detections. But they're essentially trying to do the same thing, right? They're trying to delete any messages that are bounce backs, and they're doing that by looking for keywords like Postmaster, Mail, Microsoft in the from address. So the last one is kind of an additional example of them evolving this technique. This is probably one of the more subtle ones that I've seen. Right off the bat, the rule name, this is like the default rule name if you create an inbox rule. So if you were just looking at that, this wouldn't stick out to you at all. They're using the from address again, but what's kind of interesting here is they're no longer deleting the message. So they caught on to the fact that like people are using that to detect badness. And now, instead of deleting it, they're just moving it, marking it as read and moving it to the RSS subscriptions folder, which like I don't think anybody uses RSS anymore, right? You're never going to look at that folder. So that was pretty cool. This one was actually a little bit different. They weren't doing spam. They were trying to do wire transfer fraud. So you can see they're masking replies that from addresses that had to do with invoicing, payment, wire, things like that. So here's another interesting behavior that's almost never a good idea, even if it is you are a user doing this on purpose. In Office 365, you can configure your mailbox to automatically send every email to a different address. And when that address is not owned by your organization, that's a terrible idea for 1,000 reasons that I don't need to explain to you guys. So at best, it's a policy violation, and at worst, this is a method for persistence as well. The nice thing about this from an attacker's perspective is, like, this is a passive way to chill in somebody's inbox. You don't have to log in and pull down their email every time you want to see it. You can just siphon it off to an email address that you create that looks very believable, right? So what we've seen, we actually had an instance like where this was the CFO that was targeted, and they went out and they stood up a Gmail account that it was first name dot last name. And it looks exactly like him, so if you're just skimming by it, but it totally was not him. So moving away from like mailbox activities, one other interesting thing you can look for is, like, obviously there are other services and applications in Office 365 like SharePoint and OneDrive. Depending on your attacker's objectives, they may actually start to poke around and use those services to try to collect data, right? There's some definitely interesting things you can look for there. So when you request like a file on SharePoint or you view a file on OneDrive, that does generate events in the audit log, and you can use that to detect the weirdness. So one thing right off the bat is just look for bursty behavior. Like, no user is going to manually go look at 50 SharePoint sites in 5 seconds, right? So when you see stuff like that, that's kind of a red flag. The other thing that's kind of interesting here is this concept of public links. Very convenient feature. I'm sure we've all used it regardless of the service. In Office 365, if you've got a resource in SharePoint or a file in OneDrive and you want to collaborate with someone, you can press the easy button and it'll generate like a pseudo-random link that you can share with anybody in the world, and they have full permissions to that file. Super convenient, right? Unfortunately, sometimes this can lead to hairy situations when users share things maybe they shouldn't share. So this is kind of interesting as well. One thing that we've come across is users accidentally sharing a parent folder that contains way more files than they thought it shared. They thought it contained. Whoops. So something to watch out for, and just ask yourself, hey, what are my users sharing publicly? And you can actually view this via the audit log as well. Something worth reviewing every month or whatever, just to see what's out there. The scary thing is, like, this stuff never goes away. Like, they don't expire, right? And once somebody sends that leak out, you have absolutely no control over it. So especially with stuff like this, kind of makes you a little uneasy. All right, so the last category I'll talk to here is, like, what if they do pop an admin? Obviously, that kind of sucks. It unlocks a lot of doors. One of those doors is this idea of delegating permissions, which is essentially impersonation. I don't know if you guys have seen Master of Disguise. It's a terrible movie. But it does kind of, I apologize. It's a cult classic, I know. But that's essentially what this is, right? Executive assistants use it all the time to manage inboxes and calendars for executives. Bad guys use it all the time to gain access to other people's mailboxes, right? So a couple things you can look out for there, like if somebody's been delegated privileges to another user's mailbox and they're not an executive assistant or somebody that you'd expect to have that kind of privilege, that's super weird. If an admin assigns themselves permissions to a bunch of other users' mailboxes, that's kind of weird. The other interesting door that it unlocks, obviously because you're using Office 365, surprise, you're using Azure, is this idea of, like, persisting via an app registration in Azure Active Directory. The interesting thing here from an attacker perspective is, like, a lot of times these applications are not subject to the same security controls that your users are. So your multi-factor authentication, your conditional access policies, chances are your apps aren't subject to all that because you want those automation accounts to work, right? So definitely a stealthy way to persist if you're an attacker. All right, so, like, we've run through a few examples of attacker behaviors, detection use cases. Let's flip over now to the investigator process. This is kind of harder than you might think. If you're a traditional security analyst or security team, you've had a lot of practice in enterprise forensics, like how to run down a piece of malware on a Windows box, like we're very practiced. But when running down stuff like this, stuff targeting your users in Office 365, like there's a lot of things that are just different and aren't natural to you. A couple of things changes, like we're very used to the host pivot, right? Something goes wrong in my enterprise, like what's going on the host, how did it get here, right? In Office 365, sometimes there's just simply no host to pivot to, right? So we have to change how we think. Gathering sources of evidence and the sources of, like, just the evidence itself is different than what we're used to. And as a result, like, the investigative question, like, is it bad, is a little bit different from traditional incident response. So, like, how can we overcome this in a security team? One approach that we've taken and have had success with at Expel is this idea of a playbook. So what goes into a playbook? So, like, I've been on both sides of this. My history is like managed security services. We have tons of playbooks. I've seen good and bad playbooks. I've written good and bad playbooks. Couple key things, like keep it simple, keep it consistent, and keep it clear. I've had good luck with this format, so I tend to start off with just like general context about like what this use case is. This is super important when like the problem we're trying to solve or the thing we're trying to run down is not natural to us. So we want to include things like, what is this attacker behavior that we're trying to detect? It's important because it orients the analyst around the problem, gets them in the right mindset. And then discussing how we're trying to detect it. Talk about your detection methodology. This again gets them thinking about why this alert exists, and helps set them on the right track to answer: is it legit or is it evil? Also, it's important to have like a guidelines for validation steps. One thing I'll call out here is I've seen in some cases people go way too overboard, like in defining process for like validating a thing. And it gets to the point where like analysts aren't even making decisions anymore. They're just following it, like, and clicking buttons. That's super bad. Like, that kind of takes it in the wrong direction. We want analysts to use their brains, right? So in the better playbooks I've seen, it's generally like guidelines, not explicit instructions, right? That being said, examples are good. And remediation steps are important as well. Again, some of these things are not what we're used to. Like, you're not going to pave a box if somebody's O365 like credentials are popped. So, but how would you respond? So we want to take the guesswork out of that, especially when analysts aren't used to interacting with these services. So you may, for example, document steps like this. It's like, okay, once you validate you have user credentials that have been compromised, like figure out what user it was, revoke all their session tokens, and like reset their password, for example. And obviously these steps will be different based on your organization, but like just giving those examples, and especially when these are new muscles that you're building as a team, are super important. Finally, and this is kind of often overlooked, like this concept of resilience, which is like, how do you actually get better as an organization? Like, yeah, we have to put out fires, we have to fix issues in the short term, but like, how do we prevent this class of thing from happening again? Like, what do we need to do security strategy-wise to prevent this type of attack? A lot of times this is multi-factor authentication, whatever the greater security control is, but it's important to track this stuff on an incident-by-incident basis so you can sort of sell that business case. So this is an example of what a playbook looks like in its full form. Again, like providing context about the attack we're looking for, how we're detecting it, and what you need to do about it as an analyst. Cool. So, I mean, we've been doing this for a while at Expel, and there are a couple like themes that keep popping up. One for sure is multi-factor authentication. Like, everybody has been beating on that dead horse, and it's way harder than it sounds, but whatever you can do. Start with your admins, start with your high-value users, but this seems to be the big sticking point for people. The other thing that seems to be causing a little bit of confusion within security teams that I've seen is like there are a lot of native security controls in Office 365, and honestly they're continuously evolving and being developed. Like, it seems like every month or so Microsoft comes out with a cool new feature. It's hard to keep track of all that, but it's definitely worth reviewing. Like, there's all kinds of cool capabilities like conditional access policies that I talk about, Microsoft has like DLP, malware, anti-phishing policies, all sorts of cool stuff that you can leverage without having to like buy a whole new product in some cases.
Additional access costs extra.
Yes, there are different subscriptions, so it depends if you want to go that route versus, roll your own or buy a product. But it seems like a lot of people just aren't aware of all the different knobs and levers that they have available to in Office 365.
Fish policy.
I think that's like Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection. They actually have like anti-phishing where I think they call them threat intelligence events or whatever, where they'll identify a phishing message and like tell you if it was delivered to a user's inbox. Pretty cool. I think it's a relatively new thing. And then just generally reviewing policy configuration. So a couple of the things that we talked about, like the ability for users to create public links to files, like you can just turn that off. And things like mailbox forwarding, again, you can turn that stuff off. So especially as you think about like how you're going to get attacked and maybe how you have been attacked, go back and think about those policies. Like what can you do to actually prevent that class of attack from occurring again? Cool. So just bringing it all together again, like Office 365 is great. We all love it. Brings a lot of cost savings, cool new features. We don't want the security of it to be an afterthought. We don't necessarily want to overestimate the responsibilities of Microsoft or any other cloud provider, right? Investigations in the cloud in general are sort of different from what we're used to, so we have to make sure that we start to build those muscles as a team. And in general, just plan ahead for account compromise. Don't wait for that incident to happen before you start thinking about this stuff. So, cool. With that, any questions? Yes.
I mentioned Microsoft does offer a benchmarking tool so you can see what of the security features you're exercising.
That is a good call out. Yeah, actually, Microsoft has a lot of pretty legit reporting now in Azure. Security recommendations, all kinds of good stuff. There's almost too many features to keep track of, but.
So you mentioned at the very beginning about turning on auditing. Off
Yes.
the top of your head, it was like 2 clicks and yay, you have auditing.
It's legitimately just a button that you click, yeah.
Off the top of your head, do they charge more to turn it on compared to storage? Or?
I'm sure it costs them something, but I don't think they charge you for it, no.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on, like you were saying, like if you want additional retention or anything like that.
Yep.
Yeah, and then if you want to like be able to like export it out, sometimes that costs more. Do SIM integrations, because like sometimes you need to do Azure AD Premium stuff, which costs extra. Basically, if you want to do anything legit, you got to pay extra. they're basic, and they promise the moon for like the basic bottom entry level tier, but then when you get there, it's like, oh no, here's a picture of the moon.
Upgrade to E3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like the ATP stuff, that's all E5.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then you got to pay for EM&S on top of that, and then like you're selling an employee's kidney every month just to cover the costs.
Yeah.
Do that?
They have two. They only need one.
You mentioned you didn't know why they didn't turn it on by default. It's basically, if you turn it on, you know about it and are potentially going to use it. If you didn't know it was there, you were never going to use it, and it's just a cost thing.
Yep. Ignorance is bliss, right?
So it's like, if you want it, sure, have it, but if you don't even ask for it, you're never going to use it anyway.
Yeah. I mean, the parallel I would draw is like, what if they shipped Windows without like the Windows event log turned on? That would be catastrophic, right? Like, yeah.
Default settings on event log are like terrible 3 days.
Yeah. Fair point. Fair point.
Can you, sorry,
Yeah.
turn it off just as easy? Like,
Yeah, I don't think you can press a button, but you can use PowerShell to turn it off. Yeah, it's pretty easy. I don't think there's like a big like stop button that I'm aware of.
there's the slider.
Exactly. Yeah, the thing I've seen is like most people go with E3 and then they sort of have this philosophical like, do I pay a whole like truckload of money to Microsoft to get some of this stuff, or do I pipe the data off to a SIM and do some of this stuff myself? So we've seen people go both routes, but there's a lot of options.
Yeah, some SIM integrations go smoother than others. So.
Yeah, that's an understatement. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Advice for sharing files and data, like to do course grain control, fine grain control. What is your experience now? What is the people doing wrong?
Oh, sharing files, that's a good point. So by default, they allow you to create public links and you can share stuff to the world, right? There are pretty granular controls. One of the things, like the easiest things you can do, like obviously you don't want to hamper people's like workflows, right? You can just force them to actually share it with specific people in your organization versus a public link, which is a lot safer, right? Because then only the person that you actually granted the access to has access to it. And you can actually do that like per user, per group. It doesn't have to be an org-wide thing. So like you could allow certain groups or people to create public links if they really needed to. But locking that down seems like a no-brainer, and I think it's almost just as convenient to like force them to share it with a specific person or group versus publicly, right? Does that help? Cool. All right, thanks guys. Thanks so much.